mic check, please.
Hey everybody, welcome back to the Ducks Unlimited podcast. I'm your host, Chris Jennings.
I'm your host, Dr. Mike Brasher.
My name is John Gordon. I'll be your host.
And I'm your host, Katie Burke.
Welcome to the Ducks Unlimited podcast, the only podcast about all things waterfowl. From hunting insights to science-based discussions about ducks, geese, and issues affecting waterfowl and wetlands conservation in North America. We bring the resource to you, the DU Podcast.
Hey everybody, welcome back to the Ducks Unlimited podcast. I'm your host, Chris Jennings. Joining me today is my co-host, Dr. Mike Brasher. Mike, how are you?
Doing well, Chris. How are you?
And also joining us today for the first time ever on the DU podcast, our editorial director of Ducks Unlimited magazine, Matt Young. Matt, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
Now, this is an exciting show. This is the BPOP analysis. Mike, I want you to go ahead and kick this off. You kind of mentioned that you wanted to encourage our listeners to submit questions based on everything that we talk about today. So go ahead and do that.
There's a lot going on right now. The breeding population survey report from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service was released last week, first time in 3 years. We've been putting out a lot of information about it. We had a podcast last week where we talked about it. We're going to be doing a series of these. We have a live cast event coming up this Thursday. And one of the things that we want to do throughout all of this is encourage people to, and because we have the podcast as a great forum for this kind of near real-time engagement as people listen to it. If you have questions, if you want us to follow up on certain on certain things that we say, that we touch on, maybe we don't touch on something that is of interest to you, reach out to us through the email that we've set up here for the podcast to share your thoughts and questions. And that email is pretty simple. It's dupodcast@ducks.org, dupodcast@ducks.org. We have had several people reach out to us already, through the years, over the past couple of years, and then even also maybe even late last week with some questions. And so a lot of times those questions become the theme for a future episode. And so, yeah, to encourage people to do that. There's opportunities to rate the podcast, to review the podcast. That's something that we hadn't really talked about, Chris. That's a very easy way for people to support conservation. You may not think about it in that way, but the more you support this podcast, the more you actually are supporting the mission of Ducks Unlimited and our efforts to conserve habitat. So get engaged in all those different ways.
Yeah, and sometimes we'll send you a DU podcast hat.
That's right. We'll do that too.
Tell them what they want.
Yeah, that's right. First thing we need to do, one thing is go back and get Matt to introduce himself.
Absolutely.
You want to do that?
Yeah, we do this with every podcast guest. What we do is we really just allow these guests to introduce themselves, name, what you've done, how long you've been working for DU, and really, why we brought you on this podcast, which is, a really, really cool story to bring to our audience. So Matt, go ahead and take it away.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. My title is Editorial Director. I oversee DU's three magazines, Ducks Unlimited magazine, of course, Wetlands America, which is a new annual publication we've come out with in the past 2 years, and, of course, Puddler magazine, which is our kids' magazine.
Yeah.
I've been a DU employee since 1992, so I've celebrated my 30th anniversary at DU this summer, something I'm very proud of. And I was part of that group that came on board when Ducks Unlimited moved from its old headquarters location in Long Grove, Illinois, to Memphis. We're known as the class of 92, essentially, and our ranks have dwindled, but there's still a few of us left around. So I'm proud to say that I'm one of them.
And you started out as an intern.
No, I did not.
Oh, no, that's right. You did the youth. The Canada trip. So that was like your introduction. How old were you when you did that?
I was 16 years old.
Wow.
Ducks Unlimited used to have a green wing essay competition. And they broke it up by flyway. They picked two winners from each flyway. And the winners, which I was fortunate enough to be one of, got an all-expense-paid trip to Alberta. And the Alberta DU Canada staff ran they call it a Green Wing Adventure. And you would go and tour DU projects with these biologists and see the work and do a lot of other fun things. So it was just an incredible experience.
How old were you when you did that?
I was 16.
Wow.
So it's kind of mind-boggling.
Yeah.
It was discontinued at some point. I think the liability, flying kids around the country like that just got too great. But it was a wonderful experience for me, and really, eye-opening in terms of what DU does and the impact on the landscape. It was amazing. At that time, the prairies were going through a very severe drought. This was in '86. And that was really evident on my trip. The DU projects in Alberta, they have a very active program where they use irrigation water to essentially fill the DU projects. So they were somewhat drought proof. That was the old term they used to use for them.
Yeah.
So during our travel, you could see that the landscape was just incredibly barren and dry, but then you had these DU projects that had irrigation water supplied to them, and they were full of ducks and they were green, and that really that's never really left me. It really was an eye opener and an inspiring trip to see what Ducks Unlimited does.
Now, the careful listener is going to fire off, and maybe several questions about why we don't still do that. We actually get that question
Maybe
every now and then.
an email.
Yeah.
Why don't we do any kind of intentional flooding, inundation of all these prairie potholes during the drought years? And we've learned over the years, right, through a lot of the investigations and kind of studies of nesting ecology of ducks and so forth. And that landscape is so vast, and we're talking millions of small potholes that are scattered all across that landscape. It's just not practical to quote, drought-proof the prairie, that way through any kind of intentional pumping. We don't do those kind of big projects, anymore, right?
Yeah, that's a great point, Mike. The drought-proof term was that is, I guess, an antiquated terminology, and right, that is a good point to make. Of course,
but that was what we thought about it back at the time.
Right. And those were great. If nothing else, they were like showcase projects and great things to show. Like we were a group of green wings or volunteers, and they really were. And I think they're still up there, aren't they? A lot of us, the kids.
And there's still value there. And a lot of those larger permanent water bodies are very valuable as molting habitat because you got to have that secure water during that late summer flightless period of molt. They're not very valuable from a production standpoint. It's probably the clarification that we should make. It's those small, temporary, ephemeral wetlands that are really drive that production, which we may even talk about here as we get into this.
Yeah. And, one thing, Mike went down and asked Matt yesterday, came to his office and asked him to join us on this podcast. And his wealth of DU knowledge, obviously.
It was obvious.
Yeah.
The moment I started talking with him, he started pulling out numbers that he had gotten from this report, and I said, you got to be on the podcast.
Yeah. Well, Matt has done the waterfowl forecast in Ducks Unlimited magazine, some of our listeners may remember, which we stopped doing in 2015 due to the fact that the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service releases the numbers so much later that now we don't have an opportunity to put it in the September-October issue. But Matt has done the waterfowl forecast for 20 years, so you were in tune. And tell us a little bit tell us about that process, but also, how you, over the 20 years, how you just worked on this. It basically became a template for you, right?
Absolutely, yes. We would. Every year they would release the numbers, typically in July, and it was then what I would then do is take those numbers and do an analysis of where the populations were relative to recent years, relative to the long-term average. Broke it up by flyway. I matched the transect areas that were most directly, or the most directly fed each flyway. That was that was done in consultation with our chief scientist, Bruce Batt. He recommended that we do it that way. And then what was really interesting about that for me was, in addition to just going through the numbers, I also called DU staff around the breeding grounds, both in Canada and the United States, and got a kind of a firsthand account of what the breeding season was like, and was really very interesting. It was great to talk to these guys like Jim Ringelman in the Great Plains office, Mark Francis of DU Canada up in Winnipeg, Ian McFarland in Alberta. So really got to know these guys, and it was always fascinating to hear their observations. So we had the hard data from the Fish and Wildlife Service, and then we had these kind of firsthand references or perspectives from DU staff, and that was always a very fun project. I had to crank it out fast because our deadline was right at the beginning of August. So there was always kind of a bit of a deadline pressure there, but it was a very enjoyable project, and I'm glad to hear that it's going to come back.
We're going to do it at least for this year. This is a significant year because it's the first time in 3 years that we've had survey results, and so we'll be cranking out a version of that for what will it be? The November, December,
that's right.
Yeah, so that the deadline for producing that is like what? Mid-September? Got a lot of thoughts up here in the head.
I was going to say, you better crank that out, Mike.
Yeah, we're getting on it.
But glad you're bringing that back, Mike. It'll be very popular. It's kind of goes to the heart of what DU does, and so I look forward to reading that, and I'm sure our readers will too.
Yeah,
and there's a lot to be learned from the survey results that we've got this year, in contrast to what we've had over the past 7 or 8, given the 2-year gap. But yeah.
Yeah, and one of the cool things about that waterfowl forecast story that always jumped out to me was, the Ducks Unlimited magazine does a survey on each issue, and Matt, you can speak to this. That waterfowl forecast piece was pretty much the most popular piece that we did in the magazine every year that you did, every single year. I mean, it was so popular.
That's right. Our readers love that, and no surprise that like I said, it kind of goes to the heart of what DU does, and it did reflect on prospects for the season. If there's good production, hunting success usually goes up. Of course, weather's always a key factor, but it's relevant. I mean, those numbers are relevant to hunters as well as to the management community. So it didn't surprise me that people enjoyed it, and we're glad again that we're going to bring it back in our November issue with Mike as the author.
Yeah, that'll be great, and that's like you mentioned with the podcast. The podcast gives us a platform that is even a little more long form than what the magazine can offer. I mean, we were limited on pages with that piece, but this opportunity here, this podcast is going to give us and give Mike and Matt really great opportunity to really talk about these numbers and discuss what some of this stuff means. We're going to start this off with the Mid-Continent. We're going to do the Mississippi Flyway and the Central Flyway breakdown of the traditional survey area there. And so, Mike, if you want to go ahead and really get the ball rolling here with this analysis, jump right in.
I'll do that. I'll reference for anybody that might have missed it, our quick little 15-minute episode that we did last week right after the numbers broke. Chris and I did a little high-level overview of it. Go back and listen to that if you haven't already, because there's some, high points in there. A couple of things I'll say here at the beginning. If you hear any papers rustling or anything like that, I apologize, but I got like 2 or 3 reports here in front of me because I got a lot of information, right? So I'll be flipping through some of this. The other thing that we didn't do, last Friday on that other episode, which we really should have done, and we try to always be careful to do, is to acknowledge the people that actually do this survey. I've seen the other interesting, fun kind of opportunity this has given us is to see a lot of engagement on our social media pages. Some of the engagement makes you scratch your head, and it's like, wait, what are they thinking? What are they thinking? But then there's also, it reveals that there are some things that maybe they're new to hunting, maybe they're new to these data, maybe they've never even heard of them, that they just don't understand about them. They see us post the numbers on our website with a press release, and they think that it's Ducks Unlimited's numbers. They're not Ducks Unlimited's numbers. They are the result of highly coordinated surveys conducted and led by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, the Canadian Wildlife Service, and representatives from selected or really a diversity of state and provincial agencies. There are a lot of the states in the South, even, although the survey isn't conducted in the South, a lot of those agencies will send some of their staff north, in some cases, to collect some of those data, serve as observers or ground truth participants or whatever. So those are the people that are responsible for collecting the data. Fish and Wildlife Service processes the data, generates the report, and then we have the fun job of communicating about it and getting it out there to the people that care about it, and then talking about it on these type of platforms. So we'll start here. With all that said,
actually, Mike,
Yeah.
Go ahead, Matt.
Oh, I was just going to say that, I've gotten to do a lot of neat things with DU over the years, but probably right at the top of my list was to accompany the flyways biologist and the ground crews on the survey back in 1998, which is a great year to be up there. It was wet. Duck populations were on the upswing. But it taught me really two things. One was that when you get up in the area, you really see, and this goes to your point earlier, Mike, what a vast landscape it is, particularly in the prairies. And you really is apparent that to really move the needle for ducks, you really have to deliver a lot of acres. Policy is very important because that impacts the whole landscape. That's very apparent. The other thing is that it's actually pretty simple. What they're counting are ponds and ducks. And when it's wet, there are lots of ponds and there are lots of ducks. And when it's dry, you might have only a handful of ponds on an entire transect. And as a result, duck numbers are going to go down. So it is just kind of simple arithmetic.
Yeah.
There's no, there's no mystery or complex aspect of it. It's just counting ducks and ponds.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that was very interesting.
Yep.
Yeah, and before we jump into there, and I kind of launched you into it there, Mike, and now I'm going to take a step back. Matt and I have talked about this a lot, and I know you and I have briefly, the popularity of this type of content. You mentioned how we posted on Facebook, and there's 700 comments, and it's hit 750,000 impressions on this one little post. And Matt and I have talked about the popularity of this type of content with when we switched from the magazine Waterfowl Forecast to the digital version, which we were, maybe hitting a little bit younger audience. Some of the communications that we have on like Instagram, and even you did a TikTok video, Mike. People should check that out.
I'm really big on TikTok.
Yeah,
these days,
but that audience, and what we've always talked about is, there's a certain generation of hunter, and I'm in there. That has never, I've always been involved with the numbers, obviously, because I work at Ducks Unlimited, but has never had to look at those numbers and be concerned that there's going to be a restricted season, where Matt, on the other hand, was telling a story yesterday about how he would get the newspaper. And Jack, go ahead and tell that story, because I think that's pretty cool.
Yeah, it's very interesting. And when you invited me on this podcast, it's something I hadn't thought about in a long time. But I grew up in Mississippi, but my mother's family is from Chicago, and my grandparents had a house on Lake Michigan that we used to go up and visit to escape the Mississippi heat. And my grandmother got the Chicago Tribune, and they had a great outdoor section back in those days. And that's my earliest memories of reading about the duck numbers, was up there in Chicago reading the Chicago Tribune outdoor page, and they did a big summary of the survey results. So I was 5-6 years old probably first times that I read that, and I was my dad hunted ducks, so I was into it too, and he was interested in the numbers, and so my memories of those reports, those survey reports, go way back.
Yeah, and that just leads us to like I said, that generation of hunter that doesn't know, has never had to look at these numbers and be concerned that season could be restricted. Now, as we get into this, Mike, we can really kind of start looking at the possibilities, not this season by any means, but where the thresholds are, and you can, as we discuss certain species and certain specific areas, I think, that kind of lends the opportunity to reflect back on that, where it's like, some of these hunters that are posting their pictures on Instagram have never been in a restricted season. So,
Yeah. My head is, and I have to apologize for the nasally, sinusy sounds if I have to clear my throat every now and then. It's just something, I don't know if it's allergies this time of year, but I just can't get rid of it. So my apologies for that. But my head is kind of spinning, thinking about all the different kind of roads that we can go down in this conversation. I've seen a lot of the comments on our Facebook site or on our post asking about harvest regulations. Why don't we restrict it? Why don't we're down lowest numbers in nearly 20 years? Feels like we ought to be approaching a restrictive season. Why don't we scale it back? And it's natural to think to feel that, and you can go back. People can go back and listen to some of our other episodes, earlier episodes, where we spoke with Dale Humberg and Ken Babcock on sort of the history of waterfowl harvest management, and they went through that phase for decades of having an incomplete, and we still have an incomplete, but having just sort of a fledgling understanding of waterfowl population dynamics and the importance of harvest in driving those up and down fluctuations. And Dale liked to refer to it as they did a lot of tinkering, year-to-year tinkering, based on what they saw the population do up or down. And a lot of that was based on the belief that harvest is what drove duck populations, both short-term and long-term. And make no mistake, you talk to Jim Nichols and others in the Fish and Wildlife Service, and they're always careful to say, you can over-harvest a population. The commercial market hunting era taught us that, right? So let's not get too loose with the idea that harvest doesn't drive populations, because you can over-harvest a population, any population, if you try hard enough. But in the modern era of waterfowl harvest regulations, data set after data set is now showing that those year-to-year variations are not closely tied to the differences that we measure in intensity of harvest from those years. So basically, I get kind of going down a rabbit hole here, but what I'm trying to say is that that instinct that we see a lot of times on social media posts is like, well, maybe we should ratchet back the harvest. And I say we, that's the waterfowl managed community. Ducks Unlimited has no role in setting harvest regulations. But it's a natural feeling. But the more our state and federal scientists have applied data, a lot of the data, coming from this report, harvest report that's also out there, banding data, it tells them time and again that for most of these species, given current regulations, they're not what are driving those up and down fluctuations, which leads to the question, what is then? It's the annual changes and long-term changes, depending on what the time period over you're looking at a change in a population, changes in habitat. The amount of habitat and the quality of that habitat that's driving that kind of stuff. So I went way off down a tangent that I wasn't planning on it, but it's relevant to the way people are looking at these data, the way people used to look at those data. Matt, that's why whenever you grew up in an era where those harvest regulations did fluctuate more frequently, right? We've been under liberal frameworks for 27 years, something like that. Yeah. That's driven by a more explicit application and deeper understanding of the data and population dynamics. And there are some species within this suite for which we have more restrictive bag limits. Pintail, that's one that we'll talk about. And there's a reason for that. Like I said, you can over-harvest a species relative to its capacity, productive capacity, and that's what their models are always trying to do, is to match up harvest with productive capacity. So, all right. That's
all right. No, that's a great point. Great point, Mike. And I'm dating myself, of course, but I remember hunting ducks during the point system days, and frequently the point amount allocated to different species changed year to year. Yeah. And that was something hunters had to keep up with, and was somewhat challenging. Yeah. When a Drake Mallard went from 25 points to 35 points. And gadwalls, they were 10-point duck, but toward the end of the point system, they went to 20. Yeah. And you could go on. But,
And I asked Jim, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but relevant to that, I asked Jim Dabowski that very question. Could we add that in our collection of history of harvest management episodes, had Jim Dabowski on, where I think it was 2 episodes with him where we talked about the point system. And I asked him that question. What kind of information, what kind of science went behind a change from a gadwall, but from increasing gadwall from 10 to 20, or another species or sex species combination from 10 to 15, or whatever it might have been? He said, it wasn't that strong. It's a lot of kind of feeling and guessing, and there was some data applied to it, but not the rigorous application of models they have today.
Yeah, and I know people complain now the regulations are too confusing, and they've obviously never hunted in the point system. It's like that would just be. I'm not very good at math either, so I'd struggle out there. Yeah,
but of hunters of our generation, Mike and I, Chris, you're a little younger than we are, but we went through that devastating drought in the mid to late '80s, and it carried all the way through into the early '90s, where the limit in the Mississippi Flyway was 3 ducks. 30-day season. You only got 2 mallards, and that was kind of our formative years of waterfowl hunting. So I always use that as kind of the baseline when I look at the survey results, and it's almost always better than what it was in that mid to late 80s period.
So, Mike, let's go ahead and jump into the...
Should we after about 20 minutes?
Yeah, 25 minutes. Let's jump into the actual survey. All right. Have at it.
All right, we're going to focus on the Central and Mississippi Flyway here. And what I mean by that is we're going to try to look at some of the breeding population and habitat numbers that, as Matt said, are most relevant to folks in those two flyways. I guess the first thing that we need to orient people to is we'll probably throw around some terms like traditional survey area and eastern survey area, and then we might even later on talk about western mallards and eastern mallards. And some of this can get confusing, if you don't deal with it every day. When we say traditional survey area, that's going to be the regions of the Prairie pothole in North Dakota, South Dakota, pretty much all of eastern Montana up through the Canadian provinces of Manitoba, Saskatchewan, Alberta, and then up into the Northwest Territories, and then over into Alaska. And that traditional survey area is broken down into individual strata. I suspect we'll break this down into some individual strata later on. Those strata are all set up based on some statistical principles and understanding of where the ducks are breeding, and we can go into a whole lot of detail on that if we wanted to, but we won't. Then there's also the Eastern Survey Area. We're probably not going to talk too much about that with the Central Mississippi Flyway, but it includes the survey regions in basically Ontario, Quebec, into the Canadian Maritime provinces, and the northeastern. I guess Maine is probably the only state that's included in that Eastern Survey Area, but there are also state surveys conducted in states from like Virginia up to Maine. There are state surveys conducted in Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Michigan, and all those are, although they are not technically included in the traditional survey area, you do find those estimates in this report, and they're relevant to hunters in the Central Mississippi Flyway, and we'll talk about those. So with that kind of backdrop, anything else that I need to orient folks to there, Matt?
I think that's got it.
Okay, so the numbers that you would have seen come out from Ducks Unlimited on Friday when I say come out, we posted the results from the report. The big number there, headline number, was 34.2 million ducks. That is a combination of 10 of the most abundant species in that in that region, plus a few others. I forget what that list is right now, but it would include species like ringnecks and do you know right offhand?
Probably golden eyes.
Yeah, I can't remember if they're in there or not. But anyway, the 10 most common species and then a few others on top of that they'd roll up to. And that was a 34.2 million ducks. Breeding ducks is the other thing to clarify. We're talking about the breeding population size. This number does not factor in the production that would have occurred this summer. So the survey was conducted in May into early mid-June, and so that's generally around the time of peak nesting, early nesting, peak nesting. So it does not count production. And if you're a hunter, what you're interested in is the fall flight, the birds that are flying south, which is a function of the spring breeding population size and how much production they had during a given year. So keep that in mind. That 34.2 million number was down 12% from the last time we had a number of 38.9 million. That was in 2019 because we had 2 years without the survey because of COVID-imposed restrictions and travel restrictions, things of that nature. And it's, I've thought about this a lot over the past few days, trying to make sense of this. People ask me, well, we were down X percent from 2019. What does that mean? That's tough because we've got 2 years of data that we're missing. To know, I say it's tough to know if we should be concerned, like by a 23% decline from 2019 numbers for mallards. What we really want to look to, I think, as a benchmark for whether we should be concerned, what direction we're headed long-term, is that long-term average. So when you compare that 34.2 million to the long-term average, we're down only about 4%. The long-term average for total ducks in the traditional survey area is 35.5 million. Now,
because this chart could be totally different based on that. Mentioned if we had the 2021 numbers, which it was pretty dry last year.
Oh, well, it was incredibly dry.
Yeah.
I would have expected the 2020 number would have been higher, because this is where this conversation can get kind of weedy. What we have to think about is this 34.2 million number is a function of, I guess you'd say, three things. One would be the breeding population size in 2020. The other would be the production in 2020, and that gives you your fall flight. And then you kind of have to look at what the survival of that fall flight population was over the fall and winter to get you back to the spring. So, yeah, undoubtedly that 2020 number is probably going to be, in the spring, was probably going to be higher than what we have this year. We also know from all the talking that we did over the past year, all the field reports, all the looking at drought maps and so forth, was that last year was near, I don't want to say near record, but it was one of the driest prairies that we've seen in 20, 30, 40 years. We didn't have the data, the pond counts from last year, but it was dry by all accounts. So we know there wasn't a whole lot of production last year. And so when you try to factor that into what we thought we might see for a duck number coming out in spring of this year, 34.2, Chris, you and I were talking about this last Friday. That doesn't surprise me a whole lot. And I knew we would be down. If we weren't down, I'd really I knew. I certainly expected us to be down because of the almost certain low production last year. So 34.2, I kind of thought it would be lower than that. I think I had put it at about 32 million. I think our colleague up in Canada, Dr. Scott Stevens, expected it to be around that 32 mark as well, but it came in at 34.2. And how do we arrive at 32? You just kind of looking back over the other trajectories and stuff and thinking what it might have been. Matt, were you surprised at that 34.2 number? Because I know you had thought about it. You tried to come up with a number, right?
We had discussed that. What we used to do in DU years and years ago is we'd take bets at what we thought the numbers would be, and it fell kind of by the wayside when the surveys were suspended. But I asked you, and I don't remember what number you came out with. I think it was in that ballpark. Yeah. I looked at these numbers as very much a glass half full, because I think what listeners out there should keep in mind is think if we had not had a turnaround in habitat conditions on the eastern prairies and on, especially in the Dakotas, Manitoba, eastern Saskatchewan, if it had stayed dry it was last year, think of what these numbers would have been like. And, there's definitely some things to be concerned about here, particularly pintails. But, canvasbacks hung in there. Blueing teal made a really nice jump. They piled into the Dakotas where it was wet and probably had great production. So, while these numbers are not stellar, I think we all ought to keep in mind that it could have been a heck of a lot worse.
Yeah.
It could have been, and Matt, you touched on the other key part of this report and of the survey is the pond count data. They survey data, or they survey ducks, count ducks, and there's all sorts of methodology behind that. The other thing they do on these transect-based surveys, I guess that's the other thing I would say, it's not a census. It's not like they're up there trying to cover this entire landscape. It's a transect-based survey, statistically rigorous, statistical principles behind all of this, measures of variation, etc. But the other thing that they're counting while they're conducting these surveys are the number of ponds in the prairies. They don't do this in the boreal forest. They don't count ponds along those transects because they're much larger, they're not as discrete as the ponds in the prairies. They don't count ponds in Alaska either because the same thing. It's a more, the ponds and wetland systems are not as discrete as what you get in the prairies. And so the pond count is important because that gives us kind of our index of reproductive potential. That's what you kind of talk about. If it had stayed dry, the number I wouldn't have necessarily, unless it affected where they settled and maybe affected our ability to survey them with a certain level of precision or something of that nature, I wouldn't have expected this 34.2 number to be much different. What I would have expected would be our optimism for what the fall flight will be, as well as the optimism for what the breeding population size next year will be, because with the return of water to the eastern prairies, both in the U.S. and Canada, this winter, late winter and spring, it gave a real boost to those wetland conditions and set the stage for good production for those ducks, as you said, that settled in that landscape. But that doesn't show up in these numbers yet. That'll show up in the numbers next year, which will be exciting to see. So the pond number for this year, which I alluded to but didn't talk about, was 5.45 million estimated ponds in the U.S. and Canadian Prairie Survey region. That's up 9% from the last time we did this in 2019. And it is pretty similar to the long-term average of 5.2 million. So from a habitat standpoint, glass half full. The stage is set for those birds that settled in that wet landscape to have a good production year. There were parts of the prairies that were still dry. Western Saskatchewan, southern Alberta, most of Montana was pretty dry. And Matt, I'm sure you have dug into this report. That's one of the other things that you can get from this is some pretty detailed narratives of what the pilots saw or summaries of what they saw relative to habitat conditions in each of these survey areas. So I encourage people to if you're really interested in this, or you really want to know what's going on, go get the report and read through it, and you will get a great assessment of what the pilots saw and kind of how all this sets up. So what else there, Matt, from a big picture?
Well, I think as you noted, the western prairies, which is really the core of that pintail breeding range, western shortgrass prairie, west central Saskatchewan, southern Alberta, that is still in a severe drought, or at least large parts of it are. And when those pintails were coming through this spring, there was no water or very little water to hold them up, and I think that was directly reflected in that pintail number, which I think is the most worrisome number in the report.
Talk about that pintail number. I think what we need to do here at some point is we've given the high level overview there, and I think it would be worth going down through some of these individual species and talking about
that's what I think. If we're going to break it down by mid-continent, we need to go ahead and do that now.
Yeah.
Because we're 40 minutes in and we haven't even done that yet. So
let's do it.
Let's do it. So, I'll throw it out there and just say, hey, one thing that jumps off and everyone noticed and I've heard people talk about is the Mallard number.
Yeah.
But how does that Mallard number translate when you're discussing it from a mid-continent population?
A Mallard, let's see.
Mallard's kind of low-hanging fruit there.
Yep, 7.2 million, down 23% from 2019. I saw a lot of people kind of getting real anxious about that. But look, people got to remember that the past, you take out the last 2 years and you go back to 2019 and before, and we had a run of really good population numbers for mallards and all dabblers. I guess, what was it? Was it 2014, 15? We had some really wet years, or 12 and 13, something like that. I need to pull up this little graph here. So this 7.2, that's why I say let's look at the long-term average. It's only a little bit below that long-term average. And that 23% decline from 2019, I think, scares people a little bit, but you got to look at that long-term average. You have to go all the way, this number, that Mallard number, is not something we haven't experienced before and isn't something that we haven't seen. We've seen numbers lower than that before.
What was it, 2006, I think, was lower than that?
It was. I actually had that. 2005 was lower at 6.7 million, and that stuff happens when it gets dry, when the prairie gets dry. This is going to be new to some of our younger hunters that haven't seen these dry cycles. And we've probably actually been on about a 20-year string of favorable conditions, at least in some portion of the prairies,
So we've been in the good old days.
Yeah, it's
pretty much
from a breeding population standpoint. Now, there's other things happening across the landscape that are influencing what hunters see. There's different things going on here. There's one is the breeding population size. There's production that translates into fall flight. But then whether that means you're going to have a successful hunting season or not depends on a whole host of other factors that also are changing. Whether we're talking about landscape change, temperature change, climate change, etc. All those things come into play when we talk about hunting success. Breeding population is just one variable in a formula, an equation that has no fewer than 6 or 10 different variables floating around from every year. So,
yeah, because you really can't take the survey data literally. There are people online, like some of the Facebook posts and Instagram, and people, they're under the impression that they're going to see 23% less mallards than they saw in 2019 in front of their blind. Yeah. And I think that's good to point out that, like, you can't take it that literally.
Yeah, right. I had a former supervisor, Barry Wilson, down at the Gulf Coast Joint Venture. Whenever I never saw this presentation, but I heard about it, and it was probably at a time when similar kind of angst was happening around some low population sizes. And so he put together a presentation where he had, my understanding of this is he had like two images, flocks of birds, compared two images of flocks of birds. One of them had 23 or 25% fewer birds, or whatever the decline would have been around that time. He had, let's say it's 25% fewer birds in one picture versus the other. And he would ask the question, can you tell a difference? Can you even see a difference? I'm telling you, there's 25% fewer birds in this picture than the other one. Most people can't, So you're right, Chris. You can't immediately translate these numbers into your hunting experiences. The other thing we know is that, hey, when populations are lower and habitat conditions are good, those individuals are going to produce at a higher rate. Sort of per capita, their recruitment should be higher. So it'd be a good production year for those species that settled in those areas that saw a relief from drought there in the prairies. We haven't even talked about the boreal forest, and its kind of relative stability and serving as a pretty consistent source of birds for the mid-continent. So, I'm looking, what I was struggling to find here is this table for mallard population estimates dating all the way back to 1955 in this report. You go back to the 80s, mid-80s, Matt, you were talking about early on, we had population estimates for mallards, breeding population estimates at 5.4 million, 5.4, 6.9, 5.7, so We've seen lower population numbers, and we've seen mallards recover in pretty short order if habitat conditions improve. So there's no reason to be, concerned or fearful necessarily of for the status of the mallard population.
Mike, I'm going to throw you a curveball on that, though. One area, which was a big story back in the late 90s and early 2000s, was the Great Lakes mallard population.
Yeah.
And that was seen as a kind of a good news story. Yeah. They were thriving, and homegrown mallards, I think we had a piece in the magazine about that, and they've kind of struggled the last couple of years.
They have.
Is that also a function of the drought? I think there was some in Michigan and parts of that region, or what do you think could be going on there?
I think I saw the summary of habitat conditions there for those three Great Lakes states of Wisconsin, Minnesota, and Michigan that form the basis of that Great Lakes mallard breeding population estimate. And I think the overall assessment was, average to good habitat conditions. Now, my understanding from based on an email from John Calusi, Minnesota, gosh, I'd have to look at what this is here. I don't have that. Minnesota's numbers were down, I think. I'm not going to get into too many details on this because I'll probably get something wrong. What I can say is that 2022 estimate of Great Lakes mallards was down 17% from 2019, and it's now 34% below the long-term average for Great Lakes mallards in those three states. There was a pretty significant decline in Michigan, which I think people are a little perplexed by. And there's other species in here where you see some dramatic declines, and they make you scratch your head a little bit because it's not what you would have expected given what we know about their ecology and habitat conditions. And I think habitat conditions in Michigan were were okay, if I'm remembering that correctly. I may have to look that up just to kind of verify, but it wouldn't have, I don't think anyone would have expected that decline that we saw in Mallards in Michigan. And here, I've got it right here. 55% decline from 2019. That was actually a 2021 survey that they conducted in Michigan, and then like 60% down from the long-term average in Michigan. So that was a little bit of a surprise, I think, to people. They're not real sure what's going on there. But when you look at that, we're only talking about, I don't mean to discount the importance of that, but we're talking about 140,000 mallards, versus a long-term average of, what are we dealing with here, 335. So, I guess just to summarize that, Great Lakes mallards are definitely a population of concern for us. There's a lot of research going on up there. There's been a lot of research into that group of birds for the last 20, 30 years. And there are some declines that are occurring right now and have been for a fairly long period of time that sometimes we don't have the answer. We're still trying to figure it out because there are a number of different variables that are driving what a population is doing. And they're trying to parse that out. DU is supporting a couple of science research projects up there right now. Hopefully we'll kind of figure that out, what's going on. Now, those Great Lakes mallards are not included in that 34.2 million that I talked about, just to kind of clarify that. But
because that's outside the traditional survey.
It is outside the traditional survey area. Yep. So, yeah, what else there, Matt? While you do that, I'm going to see if I can find that Midwest summary of habitat condition. No, it's good.
Well, that was, as I said, having done the survey articles way back, that was an area that was a good news story. And so that is, when I saw those numbers in the Great Lakes, I was just curious what your take would be, and I guess we'll find out. We're doing research but it's like an interesting subpopulation. It's very important to hunters in those states. Those homegrown mallards in the Midwest are important to Midwestern hunters. And
I did find the paragraph here, and this is the additional information beyond the graphs and the tables in this report that I think a lot of our hunters could geek out on. The Midwest U.S. Says the Midwestern U.S. was generally wet with colder than normal spring temperatures across the northern regions. Minnesota recorded the fourth wettest year on record. Michigan habitat conditions remained excellent. The statewide wetland index declined slightly, but remained 2% above its long-term average. Kind of how do you square that with a pretty large decline, percentage decline in the number of mallards you're seeing there? Don't really know. Great Lakes water levels remained above their long-term average. Wisconsin experienced wet conditions similar to elsewhere in the Great Lakes. So sometimes you're going to have that. You're going to have a year where you look at a number and you're like, what's going on there that doesn't really square with what I would think it would be. There's some noise around these surveys. And when I say noise, there's some factors that you can't control for. Every one of these estimates has a measure of variation around it. So you kind of have to keep that in mind as well. And that's why, as we mentioned last week, one of the most important aspects of all of this is the continuity of a long-term data set. For example, if we only had 2 or 3 data points for Great Lakes mallards, we wouldn't know what to do with that. But we could, because we have 20 or so years of data and we can see that long-term trajectory, it increases the confidence. It increases our confidence that is a real decline, and we really need to figure out what's going on there. So I wouldn't freak out too much over a 1-year change that may seem concerning. Got to keep an eye on it in future years. There are some of these sort of significant declines that you can look at and you can say, I expected that based on what we know about the ecology of the species and the rigorous nature of the data that we collect from some of those areas. I'm thinking about prairie nesting species, and we know they didn't produce a lot of birds last year because of the severity of the drought. So do we want to talk about pintails?
Yeah, let's get into pintails. I mean,
that was the species that kind of made me ask Matt to come on the podcast, because I walked into your office and you was like, you asked me, did you see the pintail number? I said, I haven't really dug into that yet. So what was your reaction, Matt? What did we find there?
Well, it's a record low. I had to go back into the tables in the back of the status report like you just did to confirm that, but I knew that was a really low number for pintails, and they're such a great bird. You always hate to see that, but as you mentioned, it's not a surprise given the habitat conditions. I guess the big question now is where do we go from here? They're right at the very lower edge of the AHM matrix for having a full season, even with one bird.
Yeah.
So I guess that just raises a whole host of questions.
And Mike, when the science team looks at this, are you guys looking at that as, with the pintail, it is a pretty specific breeding habitat, like Matt mentioned earlier, there's, eastern Alberta, south,
southern
western
Alberta,
Saskatchewan, like right in that little corner, like that's pintail country, those areas. And if they're dry, how does the science team react to knowing that habitat and then seeing this record low number?
Well, what I would say, and I've said this to some other person, conservation is a long-term game. It's not, we don't overreact one way or the other to 1 year of data, whether it be an increase or whether it be a decrease, unless there's something that we know is like, I don't know if we've ever had this kind of situation where we've seen a dramatic decline and we're like, oh yeah, that's because of this one big catastrophic event that we have to triage. I don't think we rarely, if ever, kind of face that type of situation. We can see some dramatic declines from 1 year to the next, but a lot of times it's caused by drought or something like that, as we've had here. So we look more at the long-term trends. And those, when we look at those trends, we try to relate that to other changes on the landscape or in their population ecology that we can measure and try to find correlation, causation between certain other changes and what's going on with that population to see if you can identify what's driving the population. Pintails are a very interesting species. And it's probably, we need to do a species profile on this one. It's just a matter of getting the right person in here. And there's a lot of good people. It's a fantastic species to discuss, and that captures so much of why what we do as an organization and as a group of conservationists is so important, because it is emblematic of the decline in pintails. Is emblematic of what happens when we see large-scale changes, declines in the quality of the habitat that a species depends upon. Pintails are a unique case because they have, historically, they've been so closely tied to that shortgrass prairie in the western edge of the prairie pothole region, southern Alberta, southwestern Manitoba, Montana, western Dakotas. And that's an area that over the past 20 years or so is not really seen as dramatic of a return to the abundant wetland conditions, precipitation that we've seen in some of the eastern portions of the prairies and on the state side of the prairies. The other thing that's happened for that species, the only reason we know this is because we invest in a whole host of scientific investigations. Some of them are on the ground data collection for the birds themselves. Others are investing in remote sensing analyses, classifying satellite imagery, looking at how the landscape has changed over decades. And what we found is pretty strong signal that one of the primary drivers of that long-term decline in pintail population is a change in agricultural practices across the Canadian prairies. There used to be a practice called summer fallow, where during any given year, and I'll probably get these numbers a little bit wrong, that's okay, just for illustration here, somewhere around half of the acreage that was in cultivation, cereal grain cultivation in southern Alberta, Saskatchewan, I'm not sure, but I don't think it was as common in Montana. But we're talking tens of millions of acres, right? It would be fallow. It would be not in production. So when that happened, they would kind of grow up in some little short grasses and remind pintails of the nesting habitat that evolutionarily they came to benefit from and they were drawn to. And so it's it's thought that it was that period of summer fallow that allowed their populations to grow and be sustained at these historically robust levels. But then that agricultural practice began to wane. They started continuous cropping year after year. And then some other things that went on there, and conservation tillage, that's the practice, I guess, where they left the wheat stubble standing after harvest, and when pintails, to hold soil moisture and all that, kind of capture the snow, and then pintails come back in the spring. They're looking over this vast western prairie landscape, and what do they see but just millions of acres of this short stubble, wheat stubble, and they nest in it. Well, then a few weeks later, the farmers come along to plant their field, necessarily so, and there's some disturbance of the nest and destruction of the eggs and nest and that kind of stuff. And so that's believed to be a big reason for the declines that we've seen. And so our challenge as a conservation organization is to try to figure out ways to work with the agricultural producers on practices that can produce the food and fiber and all the stuff that we need off the land, but also kind of create a landscape that's suitable for pintails. So I went way farther down that road than I anticipated. But one of the upshots of that is we've seen a decline in average pintail productivity over the years. They don't renest as prolifically as mallards or blue-winged teals do. So when you lose that initial nest attempt, they're one of the first ones back. When you lose that initial nest attempt, then they're not going to renest as often or as prolifically. And there's a number of other things that are probably going on there as well, but that's just kind of a sneak peek at kind of what we think is going on with pintails in the prairies. Pintails in Alaska are sort of a bright spot. Alaska birds are going to be somewhat important to hunters in the Mississippi and Central Flyway, but that population, that group of birds really becomes important for Pacific Flyway hunters when you talk about that. What did I forget?
Well, one thing that you didn't mention that you had sent in an email, I think on Saturday when you were crunching all this data, you put out a number out there to show how close those population estimates were on pintails to becoming a restricted season and closing that.
Yeah, I want to be a little careful on that because I'm not participating in those discussions. What I'm just doing is kind of looking at the matrix and looking at the report that's out there from the Fish and Wildlife Service, a public report, nothing secret about it. And if you take the time to try to understand all the stuff that's going on in those models and the matrix that they put out there, it's a decision support matrix is basically what it is. It tries to distill this complex ecological system into a couple of variables that our harvest managers can use to make informed science-based decisions about what the, quote, optimal regulations for a given species and given year will be. And this is a system, a regulatory system that's in place only for the U.S. Canada has their own system of regulation setting using a lot of the same data, but there's some differences there as well. So what we're talking about here is the U.S. And go back to encourage people to go back to our series on the history of waterfowl harvest management. We had maybe 4 episodes with Jim Nichols where he broke down all the different aspects of adaptive harvest management. And fundamentally, any decision that we make, whether it's harvest or habitat or whatever, or a decision that you make about going to the grocery store, it begins with an objective. What is the objective you're trying to achieve with that decision? And so that factors into it as well. So you have to understand that. But the bottom line is that with all those kind of caveats, if my look at that matrix suggested that we were within about 84,000 or so birds, pintails, and that breeding population size of being faced with the optimal regulatory decision, maybe being a closed season. Now, there would be a lot of other conversations that would have happened at the Flyway Council level between the states and the feds on what they would have actually done. I have no idea what those conversations would have looked like, and some of those conversations about the data in this survey report and the AHM report are ongoing this week in 3 of the flyways: the Atlantic, Mississippi, and Pacific, actively having some of these discussions about what all of this data means, what their AHM models mean. Important point here, all of those discussions about the regulations as informed by the data in these reports is relevant to 23-24 regulations in that year, a year out. You mentioned early on that the Fish and Wildlife Service has started setting regulations a year in advance. Canada is actually on a system now where they set regulations for 2 years. And we can talk to someone about that, how that came to be. And so, a year in advance, the regulations for this year are unchanged. They're informed by a lot of the modeled estimates from last year. So don't worry about anything this year. And the other, I guess the high-level thing that I'll say regarding harvest regulations, because they do all these data from the survey, the Breeding Population Habitat Survey, factor into them along with other data, is that the Fish and Wildlife Service, I think there's something in here that says for the most part, Fish and Wildlife Service does not expect major changes in regulations for next year. And so some people may hear that and like, what do you mean we're down 12% from 2019 and below the long-term average, and mallards are down 23%? You got to remember, there's a lot of things that feed into that harvest management decision, but an important part of it is going to be that pond count that we actually found this year, that they surveyed. That was real this year. Some people are going to say we make data up. You get that too, right? That doesn't happen, I promise you. But yeah, it's that increase in wetland condition, wetland number in the prairies that was estimated this year, that when factored into those models is going to project pretty good production and allow for, that liberal season in 23, 24. That's going to be the recommended optimal regulatory decision for all four flyways basically in 23, 24. None of that's final right now. I have to say that. None of that's final. That's just a recommendation. Ducks Unlimited doesn't have any say in that. Those are discussions between the states and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and all that happens through the flyway councils.
Absolutely. And Mike, I think this is a good point where we can just kind of wrap up this episode and then start looking at some of the other maybe species-specific stuff.
We're going to do 2 episodes on the Mississippi and Central Flyway.
I know Matt and I were just getting ready to walk out of the studio because you were on a roll. We were just going to let you go. No, so we can we can dig into a little bit more of the mid-continent survey.
You asked the question. You got me on the harvest regulation.
I got you rolling.
So, yeah.
But then also, we really need to dig into in the next episode, we need to talk about the Pacific Flyway and the Eastern Survey data.
Yep.
So,
and we haven't talked about gadwall, widgeon, teal,
and canvasbacks. That is a good news story, I guess.
Absolutely,
certainly in comparison to the pintails. And
redheads as well.
Redheads also. Mm-hmm. That's great news. And harvest regulations have been liberalized on canvasbacks recently with the 2-bird limit, and they've hung in there. They went down a little bit this year, but I guess that's probably, Mike, a function of the water in that eastern portion of the prairies. It's really important for canvasbacks. Yeah,
no doubt. Why redheads jumped up 35% and 36% over the long-term average. Some of those species can kind of pop around year to year, and like I said, you can't explain every 100,000 bird move here or there, but that's why I say the long-term trajectory is good. But it's an uptick in redheads, or at least a healthy redhead population is consistent with what we've seen long-term for that species. So another bright story.
And that's not surprising based on the videos that you got last year, and then kind of...
That's like 2 years ago.
Was it 2 years ago?
Yeah.
Down from Laguna Madre?
Yeah. So here's the other dangerous thing to do is to look at that other report that comes out. It's the Fish and Wildlife Service produces, made possible by the data provided by our hunters that participate in those harvest surveys. That report is out also. There's like 6 reports that come out all at one time. So waterfowl population habitat report, there's the adaptive harvest management report, there's the preliminary estimates of waterfowl harvest from the past 2 years, then there's like a woodcock report, sandhill crane, bandtail pigeon, mourning duck. They're producing all these reports. They all come out at the same time.
And it's like overload for you. You about pass out.
Yeah, absolutely, as you can tell. And so the dangerous thing to do is to dig into that harvest report and look at, what was redhead harvest last year? And redhead harvest was actually down last year. And that's not dangerous. The dangerous thing to do is then say, if redhead harvest was down, maybe that's why we didn't see as much of a decline in redhead numbers from 2019. You're tempted to do that, but then you got to remember there's a 2-year gap there. What did redheads do between that 2-year gap? So there's a lot of temptation to use data in a way that, maybe you shouldn't.
Yeah.
But it's fun to do anyway.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And I think, in the next episode, we'll dig a little further into the canvasback, because I think, like you said, Matt, that's a good story. That's a positive story. But for this one, we're going to go ahead and wrap this one up. Hey, Mike, this has been great. Matt, appreciate you joining us. Matt, any last words before we get you out of here?
No, it's just a lot of fun. As always, it's always a thrill to be with our science team and hear their perspective and take on the latest waterfowl surveys. It's as you can tell, from us, the length of time we spent talking about just a tiny part of the data, it's something you can talk about for hours and hours.
Yep, and we definitely will. Absolutely.
That's great.
I feel like I talk too much sometimes.
No,
Don't
it's
gotta
perfect,
interrupt me.
Mike.
No.
It's perfect. I'd like to thank my co-host, Dr. Mike Brasher, for really getting excited about the data and really digging into it and explaining what some of these numbers mean to your average hunters and your average podcast listeners here. I'd like to thank Matt Young, Editorial Director of Ducks Unlimited Magazine, for joining us today and providing an awesome, kind of a historical insight on the data, which is just fantastic. I'd like to thank Chris Isaac, our producer, for putting the show together and getting it out to you. And I'd like to thank you, the listener, for joining us on the DU podcast and supporting wetlands conservation.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the DU Podcast. Be sure to rate, review, and subscribe to the show, and visit www.ducks.org/DU Podcast for resources based on today's topics, as well as access to more episodes. Opinions expressed by guests do not necessarily reflect those of Ducks Unlimited. Until next time, stay tuned to the ducks. Stay tuned to the ducks.